This is a special report from Beck News.
Because it could turn up yeah, and he'll have something to say. I'll tell you that. Ready?
Okay. Well, all right, we'll call this meeting to order. First order of business is to stand and recite the Pledge of Allegiance. The flag is right over there. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Joel?
All right, can everybody hear? Purposes of tonight's meeting, of course, is for the public hearing on, well, we'll start the official word, is the zoning ordinance 23-01-01, which is pertaining to the setbacks for pipelines in Emmons County. Just a few little housekeeping tidbits. First of all, this meeting is being broadcast live on Beck TV, and it's on, I don't know which channel, but it's also being live streamed on their website. Piggybacking on that, I'd like to keep the swearing to an absolute minimum or none. So if you're speaking, please just remember you're on TV and there's maybe children watching. So the format for this meeting, we will begin with allowing Summit approximately 10 minutes to just give an overview of the project, because even though this setbacks is about all pipelines in the future of Emmons County as well, it's mainly pertaining to Summit because that's the current project that's up for discussion. So let me give them about 10 minutes to begin their process how they see fit. After that, we will allow for questions, but you're going to have to come to the podium because we're not going to pass a mic around and do all that. But if you want to come to the podium and ask some questions, that's allowable. And then after that, we will have testimony. I'd like that testimony to be residents of the county because that's the ones who it's pertaining to the most. And then after that, we'll probably wrap up the public hearing with some opinions from either the state's attorney or the commissioners if there's something that needs to be said. There's 5 commissioners in Emmons County. 2 of them are not here tonight. One of them did have a vacation planned, so we were going to proceed with 4, and then that commissioner came down with COVID, so he's at home. So just first and foremost, we are not going to be making a decision tonight. We are going to have the public hearing because it was set, everybody was planning for it, and a decision will be made at the next county commissioner meeting, which is in approximately 2 weeks. It's the first Tuesday of the month, which I didn't look on my calendar, unfortunately, so I can't tell you the date exactly, but I believe it's the 2nd. Okay. We're going to set aside about an hour at that meeting, and that is when all the commissioners should be present, and we will make a decision then. So just so everybody understands how the format's going to be, that's how it is. We want to keep it peaceful. Everybody's allowed to speak. I'm expecting probably some passionate testimony, and that's great, but we're going to keep it orderly and we're going to keep it under control. If it's not, I will issue a warning. If that warning is not obeyed, you will be escorted out. So just a fair warning for everybody on that as well. Other than that, I don't believe there's anything else to say unless somebody else has something. If not, I believe we will turn the floor over to Summit, and they are allowed to do what you need to do. Give you about 10 minutes on that, okay, guys?
Thank you, Chairman Magrum. Bringing to the table with me a couple of our guests, employees of Summit Carbon Solutions, and I want to introduce them very briefly, and they will be speaking as well. We'll be as quick in our comments as we can, but I want to introduce to the crowd some of those people who are available to answer some of the questions that may come up. So to my immediate right is Grant Terry, Senior Pipeline Project Manager. To his right, Rod Dillon, Director of Regulatory Compliance, and next to him is Jay Volk. He is our Sequestration Director of Health, Safety, and Environment. And my name is Jeff Scari. I'm the Director of Land, Legal, and Regulatory within the sequestration area of Summit Carbon Solutions project. So a little bit about what I want to discuss today for the commissioners. I have some remarks with some slides, and then we have, of course, comments from Terry Grant on his on the construction process, and then followed by Rod briefly talking about some of the safety components. And so the thought today is to hit those 3 points. Today we'll go to the first slide. So first I want to talk about the pipeline's impact on North Dakota, and then we'll move into the construction and the safety part. So Summit Carbon Solutions project is strategic for the future of North Dakota's ag and energy sectors, right? So North Dakota's agriculture and energy sectors comprise about approximately 70% of our state's economy. Ag and energy are both reliant on linear infrastructure, including electric lines, rail lines, roads, pipelines to move their products to market. And I firmly believe, and our position is that in order for these sectors to continue to thrive, they need to come up with a carbon management program. So as we move forward, let's take it to the next slide. So our project at Summit, we've essentially partnered with 32 different ethanol plants across Iowa, Minnesota, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. The design is to the capacity is to capture and permanently store up to 12 million metric tons of carbon dioxide per year, which is going to open up new economic opportunities for ethanol producers, strengthening the agricultural marketplace for farmers and generating new tax revenues for local communities. On our next slide, this is where I want to spend a little bit of time. One of the questions that came up to me prior to our introductory, our remarks was, how many different plants do we have on tap and what does this look like? So what you're seeing here on this particular map is the general outline footprint of our pipeline. And what you see is at the end of each of those lines, essentially, is there's a blue dot that would represent one of our partnered facilities. What you also see on this map are a number of white dots on there that represent other either ethanol or fertilizer type plants, something that would be a CO2 emitter, that would be a target that we could add on to our system. And what you also see on this particular map is essentially the gray shaded areas that are representing your sandstone formations and your opportunities in places where you can possibly inject CO2. And so what you see in the bottom right-hand corner in Illinois is part of that Illinois basin, and where you see that they have some sandstone formations in that particular area. You also see over on the western portion of Nebraska and into Wyoming, your Powder River Basin, your other formations where you're going to see other sandstone formations. And of course, you can see the outline for the state of North Dakota. And North Dakota is a wonderful state in the sense that we have tremendous geology, and in this particular situation, what you're seeing absent across that Midwest section, essentially your corn belt for these states, is a lack of geology that is capable for injection for CO2. And so the reason I bring that up is because I think it's important, especially for this community, right? Because at the time that the oil industry in North Dakota needed a pipeline to come out, and we're all familiar in this direct community that the DAPL line comes through this county, right? And in Iowa, of course, that goes through Iowa. And in Iowa, they recognize that in order for that industry to survive and for these things to thrive, that a pipeline was necessary to bring it out. And what we have today is a situation in which the majority of those ethanol plants are in need of a carbon management solution, and North Dakota has that solution. And so in reverse, in this time, essentially, we need to bring a pipeline to North Dakota so that we can go ahead and assist all these ethanol plants and make sure that that their longevity is protected. So one of the questions came up, you can see on there are some North Dakota plants. One white dot that is just below our area, Red Trail Energy, of course, is seated right in the geology, and they've done their own injection wells and are currently under operations over in the Richardson area. And you can see that there are other plants. So the long-term expansion opportunities exist. And what's important to know and understand is that Summit Carbon Solutions, there are a number of other competitors that are working on these projects. They include Wolf, they include Navigator, and I believe Tallgrass Energy. And to put this into perspective for the people in the room and for you commissioners and chairman, those projects are intended, two of them are intended to take CO2 to Illinois. And the other one, of course, is taking it across state and going into that Wyoming area. And what that means for the ethanol plants that are on the northern edge of this is that they are far enough away from a system that the benefit to North Dakota doesn't exist. They will take their CO2 and go into a different direction. And so we believe that it is strategic for North Dakota to be able to build and complete this particular project, because we believe that in the long term, this will make those ethanol plants continue to be viable. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. I want to be brief in my comments. Everybody knows and understands that if you were to take 3 pounds of corn, you will create 1 pound of ethanol, 1 pound of a distiller's grain, and your byproduct that would represent essentially 1 pound of CO2 when compressed into a dense phase gas supercritical state. And so the next slide will show us how that process works. Obviously, you harvest your corn, you take it to market, and you're producing that low carbon fuel ethanol. And that low carbon fuel ethanol can be sold into a number of different markets at a premium, which gives us an additional revenue source for our project, as we partnered with a lot of our ethanol plants. They are partners in our project as well. And so we are helping them to be able to secure essentially a low carbon index score that will allow them to sell their fuel into a bunch of different markets. But before we leave this slide, there's some numbers there that I want to try and highlight. One of which is you'll see underneath the United States, the ethanol industry as it is spread out across sort of those Midwestern states that we just saw on the previous map. That is about 50 billion of annual GDP contribution per year. So to put this into perspective, the ethanol industry as a whole, that number is very similar to what the Bakken is as far as annual GDP contribution. So the ethanol industry is on par with what the Bakken industry is, except of course the Bakken is in the western third of North Dakota and obviously into Montana a bit as well, but spread out over those 5 to 6 Midwestern states. So putting that into perspective for everybody. So after we generate the low carbon fuel, if you flip to the next slide, and this has been updated more recently, what you see in the dark blue on the West Coast, some of the blue in the states, Canada, Minnesota, and some of those proposed across the Midwest, is your demand for your low carbon fuel markets. And so, commissioners, what that means is that in order for these ethanol plants to survive, they need to have a carbon management solution, like we discussed. And if so, then they're able to go ahead and sell their fuel into these particular markets. And if they're not able to, they won't be able to sell their fuel into those markets. That's the direction these projects are trending. And so if you look across the bottom of these particular slides, you're going to see that that's about a 6.1 billion annual gallons of fuel per year that we need to continue to support and develop. And so if we go to our next slide, I want to shift gears for the moment and talk about some of the economic impacts directly to the state of North Dakota. We're seeing about just short of $900 million of investment into this particular project as it comes across the entire state. You can see on there as well, I don't have my glasses on and I didn't expect to be this far from the screen, and I don't know that my glasses are going to help, but we'll have some additional investment across the state that you can see on there. Dave, let's go to the next slide. I also took the moment, we hired Ernst & Young to do a independent evaluation of what we believe the tax impact is going to be to the various counties across the footprint of North Dakota. And obviously you can see in Emmons County that reads 37 miles, and we have an estimated annual property tax that we believe is going to be in that north of $400,000 per year. So I've gone a little over my time. Happy to use these next two slides, I believe, to talk a little bit about the injection and what we're going to do. I think maybe I'll reserve those for some of the questions as they come up. But I do want to give an opportunity for Grant Terry to give a little bit of comments on what he has.
Yeah, I think you could continue. I'll give you another 5 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I mean, we have to keep some limitations.
Yes, no, understand. No,
I don't think anybody wants to be here till midnight, so.
Again, my name is Grant Terry. I'm a senior pipeline project manager with Summit. I really just wanted to speak to some of the constructability and construction concerns that, whenever he gets up and kind of gives the overall perspective, it doesn't really get down in the nit grit and the safety factors and what goes into the actual construction of the line. Based on a lot of the meetings I had, one of the things that I do like to start with is, this is a new technology. It's not. There's 5,000 plus miles of CO2 line that's in service today. And so I think the reason that this line gets as much limelight as it does is it's going to be the largest CO2 system in the world. That being said, it is categorized as a 900 class system. That's based on the pressure rating. It does have a MAOP, or a maximum allowable operating pressure, of 2,183 PSI. Now, that's not saying that it is going to be at that pressure at all points across the line. That's just a maximum that the line would operate at in high congestion areas. Moving on from that, one of the big things I do like to point to is the regulation of the line itself. I've heard a lot of comments at a lot of meetings that our line is not regulated. We can essentially do whatever we want. That's not the case. We're number one regulated by the federal government through PHMSA. That document is a publicly available article. It's called CFR 195. CFR.195. And I believe it's in the second paragraph, so 195.1. It states CO2 is regulated with all other hazardous liquid pipelines. And again, that is on the first page. It's there for anyone who would like to do their own research. And one more time, that is CFR 195. Now, again, that's just the basis. If a state has additional state requirements as far as regulation goes, that would go along with that CFR 195. Those are typically incorporated, but ultimately, the federal government they are the controlling party. Moving on from that, I do like to move into survey and how important it is when you're designing and building a project such as this, and especially one of this scale, traversing 5 different states. When it comes to an initial route, so typically you're going to go get on Google Earth or whatever GIS system you have available, and you're going to plot a route. And once you plot a route, that's when you bring in your biological, your historical, your environmental, and your standard just topographic survey. And that's what takes that overall route and corridor and refines it based on those survey findings. So, if we encounter a waterway or a historical artifact site, those are the type of instances that signify how important that survey is, so that we can avoid those. And when it comes to constructability, survey is incredibly important. To give an example, I know that we received testimony within the last 2 days that on a track that we didn't previously had survey, that brings up an issue based on our route and a structure that's not present on older imagery that we're utilizing. Now, it's instances such as that allow us to have communication to adjust the route as necessary. The route is not final. It adjusts minor every day. And that's through landowner communication, through constructability reviews from members such as our construction team. We have construction managers in every state who are out driving the route on every single day. So those are just a couple topics I like to point at when it comes to survey and how important it is when you're designing and building a line, any line of any size, but how important it is for a line of this size. A couple other things, I know that we're time here, and these are the main points that I like to identify that of what we're doing differently from a standard company. And these are areas that they wouldn't necessarily have to do, but we are. Probably the biggest one is, per PHMSA and CFR 195, when we're building the line and welding the joints of pipe together, they only require that you X-ray or NDE, non-destructive examination, 10% of your welds. So that's 1 in every 10 welds would be X-rayed to ensure the integrity of that weld at that level of detail. Now we're doing 100%. That means every weld on this 2,000 plus miles of pipeline is going to be audited by not only a level 1, level 2, but we're hiring a third-party contractor that would be a level 3 auditor that is checking the first contractor's work. That's an additional step. So every single weld on this pipeline will be X-rayed and audited 3 different times to ensure the quality and integrity of every weld on this pipeline. Now, moving on from that, another step that we're taking to ensure the integrity and quality of this line is major HDDs and, qualifying, and that's a horizontal directional drill. That's when we go under a waterway or we go under a major highway or go under a road. Typically, if it's a qualifying weld or a qualifying HDD, I'd say if it's 500 feet or more is typically the rule of thumb we like to use. That will be pre-tested above ground in a 4-hour test to ensure that before we put that in the ground under the road, that the quality and integrity of that pipe during a hydro test would not fail under a road. So that's a pre-test before the main hydro test that happens before commissioning of important or qualifying HDDs and bores throughout all 5 states. So that's another non-requirement that we are going above and beyond to do. Some additional things is the additional foot of depth that we're going. So we're going 4 foot minimum top of pipe. Now, federal requirement, such as like with Dakota Access, they started at a 3 foot minimum. And that's what the federal government requires. And we're going an extra foot of depth as a minimum. And then in areas where, say, we encounter a farmer and, he has his drain tile at 4 foot depth. Well, we're obviously not going to cut straight through all of his drain tile at 4 feet. We'll go an extra foot or an extra 2 feet. So that extra foot is just a minimum, and that's where we start, 4 feet. Typically, we'll go below that if necessary. And then finally, one of the big concerns is, where our block valves are located and, how are those block valves going to be controlled? Well, every mainline valve on this project is going to be remotely actuated. If we have electrical power available, it'll be electrically actuated and monitored remotely from our control center in Ames, Iowa. And they'll be monitoring that control room 24/7, 365 for the life of the pipeline. And if electrical power is not available at a certain site, it'll have a solar pack on it. And that solar pack allows for the same capability as that electrical system, but the main thing is every valve will be actuated on this project, and that is not a requirement by the federal government. And I had a few more things, but I know you're limiting on time, but those are the big points I wanted to cover.
Well, the information you're given is probably more the information people wanted anyway, so I would say, if anything, I'll let you keep going a little bit. 'Cause
Sure.
This is answering even some of my questions.
Sure.
So, go ahead.
A few other things, one of the questions I have is, how far your valve's going to be separated. So typically, you're going to have the minimum, which is the federal required 20 miles. Now, that's not to say we're going to have 20-mile gaps in between our valves. You take your 20 miles, and then you conduct what's called an EFRD study, and it's part of the engineering design phase, and it goes into every hazardous liquid pipeline. And what that study does is it's essentially a very detailed risk analysis. And it brings in HCAs, drinkable water sources, a bunch of different factors, and it peppers and adds valves in between those 20-mile segments based on the study. So you have your 20-mile basis, and then you have your engineering design study that adds them in as needed in between those. One of my other things that, and I don't think it's discussed very much, is really what goes into, once the line is built and commissioned, we're not sitting back and just waiting for something to happen. As far as if there was an anomaly with the line, we're not waiting for a leak to go out and fix a leak. Through what's called an integrity management plan and the steps that operation takes during the actual operation of the line, you have an extensive study that goes into the construction process where you're doing soil resistivity testing so that you can install the proper AC and DC mitigation across the line, which is essentially just it prevents corrosion along the line. And AC mitigation is in your higher resistivity areas that you're going to have, more protection for your line. And that's something that your internal IMP department is managing as a full-time job, 24/7, 365 during the entire life of the project. And another step that we take is, the federal government requires a repeating what's called a SMART tool run, which based on the length of the line, it can be, I've seen some that are 20 feet long. And it is just a very advanced piece of equipment that goes on the inside of the line during normal operations. And it moves typically, I'd say at 2.5 feet per second. And what that is it's a reading for any kind of metal loss or dents. It's like an MRI of the pipeline. And that will traverse the entire length of the pipeline. It will present a report. And based on that report, if there are any dents in the line that are beyond that qualify for a certain severity, that dictates a repair procedure based on that IMP plan. And that's something that we have to do repetitively for the entire life of the line. And that's separated from the normal pigging procedures. And I call it pigging. They're essentially sending a tool through the line that would clean the line and prevent any kind of debris buildup. And I mean, that's normal operations. So the IMP plan and what goes into that, and that's a normal procedure when it comes to pipelines such as this. So, and that's so that we can be proactive on anything as far as anomalies, as opposed to being reactive. We're not waiting for a leak to happen. We're doing everything that we possibly can to ensure the integrity of the line through construction, through commissioning, and through operations. And that's all I had.
Okay, well, thank you. That was some pretty good information. So,
Chairman Megrum, you have Rod Dillon, who you have some materials you'd like to add as well, just a brief from the safety component as well, a little additional in the construction.
I think I wouldn't mind saving some of this stuff for questions now, because at this point, I mean, you've gotten about 20 minutes, so I feel like that was fair. So, okay. So at this point, I guess the first part would be if there's any immediate questions that want to be asked, you can come up to the podium and ask them, especially while these guys are here with this information. If not, if you just want to give any kind of testimony at all, you're more than welcome to. So, or do you want me to start picking people out of the crowd? Okay. Go ahead.
Chairman Magrum, Chairman Materi, Chairman Hold. Well, I've got a couple pictures here. Can I address you and give you these for my farm where this pipeline is running? Sure. I want to thank you for giving me the time to address this situation, how it affects us personally on our farm. As you can see, Section 6, Section 7, and Section 8. And I am on my farm is on Section 7, my son's is on Section 6. Our two farms are exactly a half a mile apart. And from my doorstep on Section 7, the pipeline, this 24-inch pipeline that they're proposing to run through is approximately about 1,500 feet from my door. So you can pretty much see that this will pretty much stop any future development on these three sections if this pipeline is allowed to run through here. It's a 24-inch pipe with an odorless, colorless gas that's very dangerous. If you inhale it, it takes the oxygen away from you. Cattle die, tractors will die, people will die. So I'm here to ask you to consider setbacks for this on any farmstead. I don't know what the right setback is. I'd like a minimum of a mile. I would actually like to see 2 miles. I don't know what is the right answer, because no matter how far you put it, you're just kicking the can down to someone else's yard. Is it 3 miles? Is it 4 miles? All I know is if a fire breaks out and I have 2 miles versus a mile to prepare, I'm in better shape. So you guys have a tough decision here. I appreciate you taking this time. You have to talk about and decide what the best setbacks would be to protect the people of Emmons County, because this is what it's about. You're protecting the peoples of Emmons County and any future development of farmsteads. So I've had 4 people from Summit over the proposed time of this project try to get me to sign this contract. And I've addressed every one of them about why I'm not interested in it, because it's this close to my property. Not a one of them considered even listening to me. So I've heard the same thing from all 4. If you don't sign this contract, we will use eminent domain. We will win and you will get nothing. So this is where I'm at, and I will fight this as long as I can, because this is wrong. And if you don't stand up to the wrong, you become part of it. Thank you.
May I?
Well, I don't think we're going to allow a rebuttal to every testimony here at this point. So I think after a certain amount, if there's some things you want to address after that or other questions, I think we'll allow that. So is there anybody else that would like to come up and testify? Sure.
Chairman and Commissioners, I thank you for having this meeting, this hearing. And sorry, I've never participated in this kind of thing before, but this one came a little too close to home. Didn't know what to do, but I have 2 pictures. Didn't have enough for everyone, so if I can just have you pass them amongst yourselves so I can show you what I'm going to be talking about. My name is Julie Smith. My husband and I are residents of Emmons County outside of Hazleton. Our property is about 8 acres surrounded by farmland. We only own the 8 acres and have not been approached for anything regarding the pipeline. The issue that I have is that our property, as you look at the pictures that I have passed or provided, in looking at that mile square, the pipeline is what I consider extremely close to our residents. We are year-round residents at that property. We are not seasonal. That is our home where we live every day, every month of the year. And I look at it, and by my guesstimate, I figure it's at best a few hundred feet from our property. I would certainly encourage and appreciate a larger setback from that property so that our property is not something that's really, really close to the pipeline. I look at it and I know that there are residences within our county that are not 100% occupied. Some of them they're empty, but there are those of us who do live on farmsteads and they are close to the pipeline. I deem our property to be really too close to the proposed pipeline that's in those pictures. Now, I don't know that it's changed. That's a month and a half, thereabouts, old, but it is in close proximity to our property. We're not impacted because it's our land that the pipeline is going through. We are secondhand impacted, no different than secondhand smoke. We are secondhand impacted because of its proximity to our property. I just thank you for hearing me out, and I would appreciate, as I said, any kind of support for a larger setback that you folks would be looking to make a decision on. Thank you for your time.
Thanks for coming in. Is there anybody else that would like to speak? Well, everybody will get a chance to speak. You'll get your turn next.
Thank you, Mr. Commissioners. My name is Chuck Kershesky. We live probably 20 miles from the proposed pipeline route, so my interest in it isn't so much our proximity, although the lady that just spoke, Mrs. Smith, I've gone past their place driving truck a number of times, and oftentimes hauling corn. I have to ask, though, if I was to ask Carbon Solutions one question, I would ask, what is the life expectancy of the ethanol plants that you are going to be furnishing over the years? Is ethanol going to still be a viable product to be marketed over the years, especially considering how things are? I don't know how many times I've heard the expression that the American farmer feeds the world, but when I also become aware of how much corn is produced and how much corn is fed to people, it is sort of an amazing amount that is burnt up in ethanol and not for human consumption. Many of the people here may have witnessed the Dakota Access circus that occurred years ago, but this is sort of a similar thing. I am reminded that much of it is already planned and it's going to happen. The gentleman that first spoke brought up the issue that if he didn't sign up, eminent domain would eventually be used. And the threat of that is just galling when you consider how few people probably are going to be originally affected by this, because we don't have much of a voice. If it went up through Bismarck, then you'd have quite a hullabaloo, but it's not. It's coming through counties like Emmons County, which has lost population since we've been here, and it is, since the last 50 years, is probably only a third of what it had been back then. So this is prime area to have industrial operations such as the pipeline to come through. I have to ask, the property tax payments, is Carbon Solutions paying that check to the county? And if so, is it going to be reliable as long as Carbon Solutions operates the pipeline? And what happens if the operation is sold to someone else, which is what happens out in the oil field? There's just a hopscotch event that happens with the wells and everything else. Is this pipeline going to be guaranteed that it's going to be under the people that built it? I hope you understand that this all seems like a rock in the hard place for advancement and for innovation and technology. But the end result is that that technology, the people here have to live with it. Not just 1 year down the road, 10 years down the road, 15 if I get to live a little bit longer. But it is going to be in the ground a long time. And that is something that, with the safety factors, I'm hoping that the volunteer fire departments are going to be trained in how to respond if there is a problem. Since I've heard that the incident in Mississippi unfortunately occurred when no one really knew what was going to happen. And I've never been exposed to CO2. I have been exposed to carbon monoxide. In our family, we nearly got wiped off the map because of that. And that is just a very strange and scary notion. Now, not many people are going to be seeing it, but you know, the lady that just spoke, I'd hate to think that they're going to be close enough that one of those days somebody's going to go over to their place and they're going to still be asleep in their beds because a pipeline that was too close and leaked, and the CO2 that hangs down on the ground took all the oxygen out. I hate to think that, and that's the worst case scenario. but we do have to live with it. And I thank you for this opportunity.
Good evening. My name is Jeff Hill, and I'm a new resident of Emmons County. And he kind of stole my thunder on what I was thinking of was we see in the newspaper and so forth, California has passed a law to outlaw all carbon fuel cars, gas cars by I think 2035. I don't know what other states are planning to do, and I don't know the viability of the electric cars. It seems kind of a fantasy to me. But that's my question. What is the long-term outlook for the market for ethanol? And, what happens if that market collapses? Is this company capable of providing a bond issue or something like that so they will continue to pay the tax revenue that they're telling us we're going to get for our county? Is that going to go in perpetuity, or like the previous fellow just said, is that going to stop if it's sold or if the market crashes or something like that? That was all I had to say. Thank you.
Does anybody else wish to speak? Okay, go ahead.
Hello, I'm Rebecca Phillips. I'm a resident of Emmons County, and my question is more about when you consider the setbacks. Shouldn't we be looking at data perhaps on what 2183 psi might do if that is suddenly released from a pipe? How far would that travel? How far would the impact of that explosion, perhaps? I don't know. What is the risk here? And I know that that's maybe not really likely, but we have to plan for a worst case scenario. So you have this high pressure material that's moving through these pipes over several miles under roads. What if one of the pipes under the roads were to be compromised somehow? I don't know, but that if you're thinking about setbacks, I think you need to plan for the worst case scenario where what if there was a leak and a break and all this high pressure material were to come out in a burst, how far would that go? The impacts of that. What would that kind of simulation, I think, is important. And then the only other question I might have is I'd be just curious to know about how many miles of pipeline this particular company has actually put in the ground themselves. Where have they actually done this before, so we could have some data on where they've actually done this and how well it's working. What do we know already about this company and what's their track record, I think is a certainly reasonable question to ask as well. Thank you.
Anybody else wish to speak?
Thank you for hearing me. My name is Cindy Schmidt, and I serve on the school board in Hazelton. I just looked at this map tonight, and awfully close to our school. I could take out kids. I think it's awfully close to the school. That's my concern. Thank you.
Thank you, Cindy. Does anybody else wish to speak?
I probably won't get any applause when I'm done talking, but that's okay. I know there's a lot of negatives about the pipeline, but I also think there's positives. And I think the positive outweighs the negative. I'm asking the commissioner to hold off on the ordinance until the legislature, which is in session right now, to act on the 8 bills that have been introduced relating to the pipeline. The state will set some guidelines on the pipelines, and that will also include eminent domains. I just think it's no use you going ahead when the state might completely have a different opinion on the pipelines. Property rights. We hear so much about property rights. A landowner, including myself, should have the right to negotiate with a pipeline without the county interfering with ordinances. I believe the CO2 pipeline will get built, but I'm concerned about the future. Should another pipeline like gas or oil cross Emmons County? We don't want these companies looking at our ordinance and say it's too restrictive, and then move on to another county for their pipelines. 5 mill levies. Last November, Emmons County voters rejected the 5 mill levy for county roads and bridges. 5 mills would have brought in $207,000 a year in taxes. The CO2 pipeline would bring in $423,000 in taxes. That's more than double. We don't need the 5 mills if this pipeline goes through here. During the preliminary budget meeting, I believe it was in August, the county went on record to charge 3% fee on the conditional use permit on the total cost of the $73 million cost that the pipeline would invest in Emmons County. $73 million. This fee of 2% would cost $2,200,000 to the pipeline. Why would we want to penalize a business for doing business here? In Bismarck, many businesses are exempt from paying property tax for several years just for moving into Bismarck. In 2021, Emmons local wind farm paid $781,000 in taxes, $750,000. That's 10% of the total that the county levied in Emmons County, 10%. Plus, they also paid the landowners of the annual rental fee, approximately $8,000 per tower. In 2021, public utilities crossing Emmons County paid $1.8 million in property tax. That's 26% of the total that the county levied on us. 26%. If the CO2 pipeline is built, that will add another $423,000 in taxes. Then the utilities will be paying 32% of all the taxes that's levied in Emmons County. 1/3 of the taxes would get paid by the utilities. I realize that some landowners, including myself, we're concerned about pollution. Should there be a break? But wind and solar farms don't have breaks. And yet there was just as much opposition on those projects.
The commission banned solar farms for 15 years because they want to do a study. If you want to do a study, hire an outside concerning firm. I don't think the commissioners can do it because you're way too partial about it. There are areas in the counties that would welcome a solar farm. In fact, I did the paperwork on our land for a proposal for a solar farm. They told me my land was too far from a large transmission line. Without the Northern Border pipeline, that's the gas pipeline, without that, Linton wouldn't have natural gas. Just look at the millions that we have saved in utility bills just by having natural gas in Linton. With a large transmission line, the wind farm could not have been built. Every farmer that sells corn to an ethanol plant will somehow indirectly benefit from this pipeline. Some have also invested in the pipelines, in the ethanol plants. I believe it was an August 22nd meeting when the county changed the conditional use permit to require 100% voluntary easements. You will never get 100%. You will never get 85%. Where's the majority rules? Minority should never rule. That's unheard of. Many landowners don't sign easements. It's not that they're all against the project, it is just eminent domain. They let the eminent domain take its course. They feel it's the best likely deal for them. When the city of Linton was in need for a new water reservoir, I was in the city council that time. We needed a reservoir on higher ground east of the city. The landowner let the city use eminent domains. He was not against the project. It was just easier for him to take that course. A little bit on my own taxes. On the land we own, which is not the best land in the county, but we pay $5.31 per acre in property tax. If we didn't have utilities paying taxes, it would be 26% higher. My property tax would be $6.69 an acre. That's $1.30 more. I know it's not easy to be on the board. I've been on many boards. You get a lot of telephone calls, but that goes with the job. You can't put out every little fire, every telephone call. You have to keep the county as a whole in mind when you act. The utilities are paying their share of taxes, and they pay a lot. I think most people have no idea how much taxes they paid last year. It'd be 26% of the taxes that are levied. Thanks for your time. I knew I wouldn't get an applause.
Does anybody else wish to speak?
Good evening, Commissioners and Summits and all the people. I'm Steve Lane, and I don't live in Emmons County, but I have land that is proposed to be crossed by the pipeline. So I feel I should have a chance to speak. Is that okay?
Can you pull the mic up closer to your,
Okay. I'll lean in closer. Is that better?
a little bit?
Okay, I do have some speaking issues. Sorry
Okay,
about
I understand that. Is your land that's being crossed in Emmons County?
Yes,
Okay,
yeah, it's close. It's over about 8 miles east of Tembic, or just north of the Tembic Road.
east of Tenbic.
Yeah,
What was your name again, Steve?
Steve Lane.
Okay,
Okay. Anyway, my concerns are more on the safety side of the pipeline, how the safety issues with carbon dioxide, and also just the general, that the pipeline is being built too soon. I've got some documents here that I'm going to speak on. I'd like you to have some.
do you want to pass them out?
Or just, I apologize for my voice, but I've
You're
got
doing fine.
some
Keep going.
some cancer issues and stuff. Anyway, the first page there is basically, it's a summary of what's attached. And the first one document is the pipeline failure and compliance order from PHMSA, which is the Pipeline Hazardous Materials Safety Administration. That's who supervises, can control, and set standards for pipelines. During that pipeline failed on February 22nd, 2020. And it was a 24-inch pipeline, which is the size of pipeline that is proposed across Emmons County. So it was a similar size pipeline. That failure was a catastrophic failure where the pipe just broke at a weld because of some soil sloughing. There was 31,405 barrels of CO2 was released by the estimate of the pipeline company. It did over $3.9 million in property damage. And the company, because of their failure to respond adequately, not having proper safety guidelines in place, and not communicating with the local governments, they were fined $3,866,734. And PHMSA, after they did their investigation, they proposed in May of 2022 that they needed to revise the pipeline standards for CO2, and that's projected to, at the soonest, be available for new pipeline construction by 2024. So I think because of that, it's too soon to move forward with this pipeline because they're building it under old pipeline standards that basically do not address the problems that are inherent with CO2 because they're using natural gas and oil and other liquid materials that they're piping, and CO2 doesn't have the same properties. When you have a failure, the gas is heavier than air, displaces oxygen, and it can spread unseen for miles, not just feet. And to support that is a Pipeline Safety Trust commissioned a company called AccuFacts to do a study on the CO2 pipelines, because the increase in CO2 pipelines the interest has increased dramatically because of the 45Q standards from the federal government that are the the tax incentives that'll allow this pipeline to be built, basically. And what the Pipeline Safety Trust is a group that, excuse me, the Pipeline Safety Trust is a non-public charity promoting pipeline safety through education and advocacy by increasing access to information and by building partnerships with resident safety advocates, government, and industry that result in safer communities and healthier environment. So they commissioned AccuFacts to do a study on CO2, and that I've included that document. It's called it says Perspectives on the State and Federal Carbon Dioxide Transmission Pipeline Safety Regulations as it relates to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration in the U.S. And basically, that is a pretty detailed investigation of the problems inherent with CO2 and pipeline design that hasn't been addressed by PHMSA in their pipeline standards, because CO2 creates different problems within the pipe. Potential fracturing, can have linear fracturing, and that create, if there's any amount of water, it can exacerbate rusting from the inside of the pipe and other things. So the CO2 pipeline is basically, I'm glad to hear the supercritical is, I believe, is a form of CO2 that you'll be pumping. Are you going to be pumping supercritical CO2?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And that requires a higher pressure, a little higher temperature for transmission. And it's also it pumps more easily because it's in a liquid, gaseous liquid state. It's not fully liquid and it's not fully gas. And it is an efficient way to move the materials. But it does create some other factors that are discussed in that document from AccuFacts, and it's pretty involved to discuss totally right now. And then the Pipeline Safety Trust on the next document, it's a 6-page document. They did a summary of what's in AccuFacts, one that looks like this. Aaron?
Yep. No, I'm looking at it. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. Anyway, that's a summary of what's in here. And I think it's something that you need to look through and discuss among yourselves and with, I don't have copies for everybody. I do have.
May we keep this copy?
Yeah, that's your, and all the.
We'll have copies made for the rest of the commissioners too.
Okay.
Okay.
That's for you. And then on that cover page that is attached, that has the websites where all these documents can be found. And then briefly there's eight AccuFacts came up with eight in their summary, 8 things that should be addressed. And I'll just read through the headings on those. PHMSA should update the definition of carbon dioxide in current regulation. Briefly on that, CO2 is only covered as a supercritical CO2 if it's 90% concentration of CO2. Any other gaseous state of CO2 is not covered under the pipeline, under PHMSA guidelines. So if for some reason the pipeline would decide to pump 89% purity of their CO2, they don't have to report to PHMSA anymore. Anything less than 90% isn't covered. So in supercritical, they don't have to be at 90%. They can pump at a lesser concentration. Now, ethanol plants, most CO2 coming out of there is higher than 90%. So if all the gas that's coming out into the pipeline comes from ethanol plants, it should exceed the 90% threshold, but it doesn't guarantee. Now, those are items that are discussed in the AccuFacts report. Number 2 is PHMSA needs to identify in regulation the potential impact areas for CO2 pipeline ruptures. And the reason for that is because CO2 there's no odor to it. It's an invisible gas. When it comes out, you'll see a cloud like with dry ice, or it's condensation of water. Or when that starts when the area starts to warm up, the gas starts to migrate. It'll follow terrain, depending on the prevailing winds, and it can travel. And it stays on the ground, and it doesn't dissipate very quickly. So it can travel in a valley or with the winds. Oil and gas, they can determine within hundreds of feet. CO2 can potentially travel miles in the gaseous state that nobody knows that it's there until it's too late. Number 3 is specific CO2 pipeline federal regulation should not be based solely on industry recommended practices. What's happened over the years with pipeline regulations, most of the pipeline regulations that PHMSA has adopted have been proposed and enacted from industry practices that have worked after failures or because of failures. So it hasn't been without any, so public input has been very limited on any of the standards that have been developed. So I think it's good that we're trying to get some public input here into what we're doing, what the state is doing, and we should hopefully try to get PHMSA to listen to the public, get some public input also. PHMSA should specifically identify how to incorporate fracture propagation protection on CO2 transmission lines. That's CO2 transmission lines, and primarily with supercritical CO2, is subject to linear cracking, which cracks the length of the pipe in a severely explosive reaction. And there can be stops built into the pipe, so those standards haven't been developed yet, and that's part of what PHMSA should be working on while they're developing these standards. PHMSA should mandate the use of odorant injection into CO2 transmission pipelines, like propane or natural gas. They should have something in there so when there is a failure, it has a distinct odor that you would notice right away. Because it's like anything else, you can have minor leaks, and they're not all going to be catastrophic leaks. Number 6, PHMSA should require CO2 pipeline operators to update their required procedural manuals related to coordination with local emergency response agencies for CO2 pipeline ruptures. And that was directly related to the failure in Mississippi because they didn't have a manual that was fully developed, and they hadn't worked with local authorities at all over a 3 and 4 year period. The counties and cities had meetings, the company never attended. So they didn't participate in any way. I'm not saying that Summit won't.
Steve, I hate to interject, but are you coming close to wrapping it up?
Got 2 more headlines.
Okay, because we're at about 14 minutes here. I think we need to start wrapping it up.
PHMSA should establish regulations setting specific maximum containment impurities for CO2 pipelines, primarily water and hydrogen sulfide. Water can create carbonic acid, which will rust the pipe, and hydrogen sulfide is a poisonous gas. It can kill you very quickly. And PHMSA should strengthen federal regulations for conversion of existing CO2 pipelines to CO2 service. That's converting oil and gas pipelines to pump CO2. They're not designed to handle the material. Thank you for your time.
Thank you. Does anybody else wish to speak?
Thank you, Commissioners, for holding this meeting tonight to give the public an opportunity to discuss the safety concerns of a high-pressure hazardous liquid pipeline proposed for our county. And I would like to give a big thank you to Steve, who just laid out critical details to what happens when there is a rupture. So my testimony, Steve, is not as detailed as yours, so thank you. I'm just going to layer right on top of what Steve presented. I've been in numerous commission meetings over the past year, and Summit Carbon Solutions has yet to present any information concerning the safety of their pipeline. I doubt most people in our communities have any clue that this pipeline is planned and that the safety of their family and friends could be affected. The high concentration of carbon dioxide traveling through a 24-inch pipe at high pressure will be devastating in a rupture. The oxygen will be displaced, leaving it impossible to breathe, and vehicles with combustible engines inoperable. Do our volunteer fire departments, first responders, and EMS teams have any idea what will be expected of them in an emergency like this? Tarsha, Mississippi experienced it firsthand. Hearing the testimony from those on scene is chilling. Citizens were left nauseated, with some suffering convulsions and unconsciousness. The fact of the matter is, this is serious, and we, the citizens of Emmons County, will be left to deal with the fallout. The representatives of Summit Carbon Solutions will be long gone. Very likely, the company will be sold as soon as construction is finished. Who's liable? Who's responsible? I'm curious to know if any of the landowners who have signed the 99-year easement was given any information on liability and injury that could be incurred as a pipeline travels through their property. Were they told that in the case of a rupture, they would need to vacate as quickly as possible before the oxygen levels drop? That the high concentration of carbon dioxide makes it an asphyxiant? The big pipeline companies claim that federal regulatory and safety requirements from as far back as 1988 ensure CO2 pipelines are safe. No need to worry. Tell that to the people in Mississippi who experience something they will live with forever. Many are still suffering from neurological conditions. That incident happened in July of 2020. Our family has owned our home section for 4 generations now. The pipeline crosses through 2.5 miles of our property surrounding our farmstead, and we too have been threatened with eminent domain. We recommend a setback of 2 miles. Depending on the wind that day, it's hard to know and tell how far the effects will be felt. The depth of the pipe is that the pipe is buried is also of great concern. A winter with record snowfall, followed by a fast thaw in the spring, means great concern for erosion. The large agricultural equipment that is used in our area could easily come in contact with the pipe if close attention isn't paid to the depth. We recommend a 6 to 8 foot requirement. It is imperative that you as a commission do your very best to ensure protection for the residents of Emmons County to the best of your ability. It isn't always about the money. Thank you.
Does anybody else wish to speak?
Thank you, commissioners, for allowing us time to voice our opinion, whether they're pro or con. My name is Mike Rorick. I am a resident of Burley County, but I do hold interest in land that Summit Pipeline is slated to cross. In fact, that pipeline is slated to cross about 700 feet from the house that I grew up in. A house that I someday, maybe my nephew's, niece's kid, may want to go back to. I don't know about you guys, but how many of you would want to live 700 feet from a pipeline that is 2,000 PSI pressure? I'm told it's a 24-inch line, and some of the statistics I was told that these valves are like 20 to 24 miles apart. Well, rough math tells me that's like 2 million gallons of CO2 liquefied that could be potentially released into the air. With that being said, I know we're talking about what, $420,000 a year in taxes generating revenue for Emmons County. Well, I'll remind you, and I think you're aware of this, there's a 10-year tax exemption on that. So where's this $420,000 going to come? You as commissioners are going to have to fund emergency services, whether that's equipment, whether that's training for emergency personnel. So if you got to wait 10 years for this tax revenue to come in on this pipeline, where and how are you going to fund these emergency services alone? Now, the land that I hold interest in also has some wind towers on from the Logan Emmons wind project. We heard a little bit a while ago by, I believe it was Mr. Vetter, about the revenue that those towers generated. Well, I don't know about you guys. I almost want to ask for a show of hands of the Emmons County property holders. How many of you property taxes went down after the Logan Emmons wind project went in? I know mine didn't. I know what I did. So I just ask you to keep that in mind. You know, we're not just talking about occupied residences. You know, like I said, there's a farm that I hold interest in that could be occupied again someday. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm not fired up about a 2,000 PSI CO2 line adjacent from it. And there's another little thing that I just seen tonight when I come in, this map that everybody was handed out. I was just looking on here, and I'm looking at the proposed route for the Summit Pipeline. And one thing I noticed, that the state school lands, if you look at those state school lands, not one of them does that pipeline go through, not one of them. So if our own government, our own state, isn't allowing this pipeline to go through its own land, what's that tell you? Stop and think about that for a minute. That's all I got.
Does anybody else wish to speak?
Thank you, gentlemen, for the opportunity to speak. Not an advocate or an opponent of carbon solutions. My land is western part of Emmons County, and I'm not impacted by it. But I am a firm advocate of property rights, and I would encourage the commission to take that in consideration, because this time it's a pipeline. We're all beneficiaries of projects that required eminent domain. I agree with Joe. I don't think you'll ever get 100% support for any project. And I think that needs to be considered, because whether it's the electrical cooperatives, whether it's the roads that we travel on, you know, that's all gotten involved and all involved eminent domain. But I would, like I said, I'm not pro carbon solutions, but if carbon solutions, if there's a safety consideration, and I'm not discounting anybody's concerns that they've brought up, if those safety considerations are at the level they should be, and if carbon solutions can address that, you know, great. If they can't be addressed, then there's no business for that pipeline in Emmons County. There's no business for that pipeline in the state of North Dakota. And I would encourage anyone that feels strongly about that. I don't think it's just an Emmons County issue. Then I think it's a state issue, and we should be engaging the state legislators and regulating at that level versus an Emmons County level, because we can say no here, and if it moves to Logan or to Kidder, we just moved it a little bit farther away, and I don't think we've accomplished anything. So if it's truly unsafe, then there's probably no place for it. And I would encourage the commission that anytime you get too restrictive of property rights, you can get into a public taking or government taking, which I don't think we want to get in that path where we get so tight on regulations that we don't allow commerce to take place. So, thank you.
Does anybody else wish to speak?
Chairman Magrum and honorable members of the commission, thank you for allowing me the opportunity to address the commission today. My name is Elliot Huggins. I work for Dakota Resource Council, and I've had the privilege of working with landowners, many people I've got to know personally in this room, over the last 15 months. After hundreds of conversations with landowners across the state and region over the past year, I feel confident in saying that this issue means more than words can express to countless numbers of people. I know the citizens of Emmons County greatly appreciate the commission being so receptive to landowner and property rights concerns. I am not here as a resident of Burleigh County to advocate for any particular policy as it pertains to the proposed ordinance. That is 100% for the people of Emmons County to decide, and I'm not here trying to advocate for any one thing or another at the ordinance. I did just want to offer some legal resources to the commission as it pertains to drafting a hazardous liquids pipeline ordinance. I think this is important information to share in light of 6 counties on the pipeline route being actively sued by Summit Carbon Solutions, 4 in South Dakota and 2 in Iowa. Does the legal resources just include a legal memo prepared by a South Dakota law firm regarding hazardous liquids pipelines, just a blog memo from attorney Paul Blackburn in Nebraska, and then also correspondence attorney Paul Blackburn has had with Mitch in Burleigh County Planning and Zoning regarding the Burleigh County Ordinance. Please let me know if you have any questions, and if the commission would be interested in this information, I would be happy to present it. Thank you.
Thank you.
I would just add last thing, any ordinance the commission passes for the citizens, for everybody here, I would just make sure your state's attorney reviews it, get all your I's and T's dotted if the commission decides to go with that. Thank you.
Does anybody else wish to speak? Does anybody else wish to speak? I'm John Beck from John Beck Insurance in Linton. I'm also a landowner about 6 or 7 miles away from the pipeline. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing us this opportunity tonight. I think what I'm hearing is nobody's getting any answers from Summit Solutions. CO2 transportation is so new that the regulations are outdated back in 1988. You know, they're old. There's nothing new. The fact that this explosion or this pipeline leak in Mississippi caused, the sheriff there said that it looked like zombies wandering through their town, some convulsing, some unconscious, some throwing up. So yeah, there's just so much unknown. And we don't know what the setback is. It doesn't sound like there is a setback because, again, the rules are aged and not real current. As an insurance agent, with, solar panels and wind towers and things like that, a lot of these insurance companies are very concerned about the extra liability that these landowners are taking on, and they're not aware of that. These insurance companies are not going to be backing them in case something goes wrong. Some people want to put solar panels on their houses to provide electricity for their homes, and then they want to sell the excess back to the rural electric cooperative. The cooperative doesn't want that liability, and so they want the insurance carrier, the insured, to cover that liability, and the insurance carriers don't want it. I can't speak on behalf of all of the carriers in North Dakota, but I know a majority of the carriers that I have, they don't want anything to do with that because of potential liability of blowing transformers at $125,000 a piece or more if there's a problem with some backfeeding. So that's just electricity. That has nothing to do with, carbon dioxide, which is an asphyxiant and has the potential to do some extensive harm. And I'm not saying that it can't be made safe, but you guys need to do what you're doing. You need to do some due diligence, do some digging, some fact checking, and set the proper guidelines. I mean, all pipelines decay at some point in time. We may not see a break in our lifetime. We're probably going to see one in the next 70 or 80 years, which would be my grandchildren's life, or my children or my grandchildren's lifetime. So, you can never say never about anything. Oh, it's safe, it's nothing's ever going to happen. We don't know that. So I appreciate you guys taking and doing your due diligence to have this meeting, to allow the people to come out and express their opinion. There was something they were talking about. I don't know how much tax advantage did we see from the wind towers that came in? Did we get what we were supposed to get as a county? Well, I think we got, when they say these projections, they're based on estimates. That's all based on current legislation, production of the project, however that scales up or down, so those numbers do vary. I'd say we're receiving close to what the adjusted amount was after the project changed several times, but the number they said after they finally began building and completed the project, yes, we are receiving close to that. Yeah, and then another individual brought up, why aren't they going through any of the state land? If it was such a safe project, why is it going all around the blue areas? That concerned me as well. Joe Vetter, I understand his property taxes are going up and so are mine. He said we could gain $400,000 in income, but that could change several times before the project is even completed, as you're aware of with the wind towers. If that $400,000 doesn't buy one road grader, it probably doesn't pay the salaries of all the county employees for 1 year. The expenses are astronomical, and yes, that $400,000 would help, but to what extent could it hurt the county? These farmers and ranchers that have lived here, their great-grandparents homesteaded this place. They built this land from nothing. They tipped wagons upside down, dug holes underneath, built sod houses. They lived through nothing. And now, they're scared. They're concerned that there's going to be harm coming to them. And we voted you guys protectors of our county, both with eminent domain and keeping the county safe and allowing, and doing your due diligence to make sure that pipelines that do come through are safe. So I just ask that you please do your job, and you will. I know you will. I'm not concerned about that at all. But if this new legislation isn't coming out till 2024, we better be careful about not breaking ground, allowing them to break ground before then. And the Dakota Resource guy, where's he at? What is Summit Solutions suing 6 counties for?
I think that's probably better addressed to the pipeline company. My understanding is it has to do with alleged violations of the pipeline, Federal Pipeline Safety Act, that counties have tried to pass ordinances that are superseded by federal law. I'm not an attorney, I'm not going to pretend to opinion on if the counties are in the right or the wrong, but that's my understanding of what the case is about.
And so I think there's just so many questions, and Summit Solutions isn't giving a lot of answers. There's being some strong arm tactics being used. There's lack of transparency. They can't tell us how far the setbacks are. They can't tell us, they don't have any safety protocols set up. There's just so many unknowns. And they don't really want to give us any of that, whether they don't need to or they don't want to or they don't know the answers themselves. Most likely they don't know the answers themselves. This was brought in, this whole pipeline is because of this huge multi-billion-dollar infrastructure bill. And it's some legislators and some green advocates that are saying, oh, this is the best thing in the world. Is it? We don't know. It's just so new. So I appreciate your time. Please spend some of our taxpayer time or money looking into this as deeply as you can. Use all the resources that you have available to you, and we wish you the best, and we trust you on this. Thank you.
How you doing?
Thank you, Commissioners. David Mock from Hazelton. We're here to talk about setbacks. So I'm going to use 1.5 miles as an example. And the pipeline is northeast of Hazelton, roughly 1.5 miles. So Summit can't guarantee this will never leak. Anything can happen. Every pipeline leaks sooner or later. So what I came up with, just on an average day with a northeast wind or straight north with a 20-mile-an-hour wind, if there's a catastrophic break in this pipe, it'll be in Hazelton in 4 minutes, roughly, 4 to 5 minutes. And to our first responders, how do you even prepare for that if there's even 50 people that can't breathe? So, Summit, we've asked them over and over at meetings what they're going to do about it. We've heard everything from, yeah, we'll take care of your fire departments. And then we've heard, oh, after it's built, we'll do something. So we don't get a direct answer from them. So my concern is for Hazelton, like Cindy Schmidt said, head of the school board, for the residents and the school kids, and even my neighbors. And if my neighbors wanted 500 feet from their house, they can sign a waiver. But, the danger is there, and we just can't seem to get the answers from these guys. So that's my main concern right now. So there's really not a right answer on the setbacks because you're talking minutes if anything ever happens. So that's all I got to say for now. Thank you.
Anybody else wish to speak? Go ahead. Sharon, you'll be next.
Hi, thank you, Commissioners. Julia Stramer. Thank you for considering the proposed zoning ordinance. We are in favor of the setbacks to be as far away as possible from residents, buildings, water bodies, highways, and section lines. CO2 is a hazardous material that is dangerously unregulated in a pipeline. What will the future of our county look like if we continue to allow these types of projects to take our land at will? Do we really own our property? Summit Carbon Solutions has plans to cross through our Emmons County cropland with a pipeline that serves no merit or useful purpose for humankind. Since Summit Carbon Solutions first contacted us in 2021, we have been inundated with misinformation, subterfuge, and threats. So as we're minding our own business, working the fields, being good stewards of our land, we now find ourselves buried in paperwork, meetings, and paying a lawyer every month. The whole project, to me, seems to be a federal money grabbing scheme, and it looks to be a make-work Green Deal invention for a select group of self-serving bureaucrats in order to become millionaires at landowners' expense. Our land is a fourth-generation owned property. We do not want it to be held hostage for 99 years. My children and grandchildren should have the right to use, protect, and better the land as we see fit, without a toxic pipeline cutting through it. We are asking that the commission will continue to speak for the landowners in Emmons County. Please work to keep the planned CO2 pipeline off of our properties and out of our county. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, members of the commission, my name is Sharon Schurmeister. I'm a resident of Emmons County. And just going back on the setbacks, just trying to echo some of the concerns like that Dave brought up, as well as Cindy. When you're considering the setbacks, you may want to have some, I don't know if a one size fits all is correct. You know, right now your policy has a half-mile setback. But like they mentioned, when it's coming closer to a town like Hazleton, perhaps that needs to be further, or where it's closer to a school or some other type of structure. So you may want to consider some variances in there depending on what it is, rather than a one size fits all. Secondly, I just wanted to say to Summit, you know, I wanted to thank the Record for putting in information in last week's Emmons County Record, because that was very useful. Good information, but it also raised some questions. I thought it was interesting where you talk about in your material what CO2 is, but you have all the safe things about it, but you don't mention that it is a hazardous gas, and you might want to put that in there as well so that people are aware. And because it is, that's why I think the setback policy, specifically for a carbon pipeline, needs to be a little bit more cognizant of that and what damage it can do to public safety. So thank you for your consideration.
Does anybody else wish to speak? Does anybody else wish to speak? Does anybody else wish to speak? Well, seeing that we're done, I guess the proper course that I think in my mind is probably to, I think I'm going to allow Summit a chance for a little bit of rebuttal, mostly because it seems like a lot of people in this room have a lot of questions. And I think I've written down some of them. I'm assuming you've written down some of them. And so I think we're going to give you a chance to answer some of them. I'll give you 10 minutes. We're going to stay strict on the 10 minutes since we've kind of gone over on a few things. But I will say one thing. It seems to me that a lot of people in this room don't feel like they're getting a lot of information from you. This is the perfect chance, with not only the number of people in this room, but probably times two that watching right now, and will watch it after this. So if there was ever a chance for you to clear the air and solve some of these issues, now's the time, because, I mean, if you don't solve some of them tonight, there's going to be a lot of hesitation. So,
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I agree with your sentiment that this is a great opportunity. Somewhat difficult to listen to the questions, and I did my best to capture some of the details there, and I will go back through my notes and try and answer them and try to stay with the 10-minute time frame. And I do have some experts here that I'd like to call on as well. So let me start at sort of first off, one of the most important sort of high-level pieces. I think that probably provides a little bit of a framework, right? As we're talking about distances, you know, take into consideration the development of the Bakken, right? The setback requirements for an oil and gas well across the entire state of North Dakota is 500 feet. The same thing is true for coal mines. Same thing is true for saltwater disposal wells. Same thing is true for in situ mining and leaching type of projects that are there. So this is not an uncommon setback, right? Just want to put that out there from the sort of the beginning to kind of point out a few different pieces. I know we had a number of people get up and provide you with some comments. I think perhaps it was slightly overheard or overlooked a bit as Grant Terry was speaking, but one of the people that got up today, and we're happy to continue to work with them, provided you with some copies of paperwork. They provided testimony in response to pending legislation. And so we are actively taking as much information as we can get our hands on. And when we find out, so in a situation when we don't have permission to do survey, we need to gather as much information as we can. So we actually found some of that information today, and we think it further informs some of our routing concerns. I think that addresses one of the citizens of your community. I think hopefully we'll be able to continue dialogue with his attorney and work for that. One of the questions that I saw come up early, I think it's safe to say that a large portion of the questions and the rationale for the setbacks is a safety concern. I mean, is that a safe assumption, do you think, from commissioners?
I think it's reasonable, yeah.
Yeah. So, and so we've got experts here who can talk about pipeline construction, pipeline safety, but I think one of the most important parts that I want to bring up is that of the 5,000 miles of existing CO2 pipelines, and over the past 20 years, and really the life of CO2 pipelines, 0 fatalities. Now, acknowledging that Sartasia, Mississippi, a very tragic accident in which we had significant rainfall in, surrounding that particular community, and a massive landslide, that I think any courthouse, any school, any bridge, when you lose your foundation, you're going to lose the structural integrity of the pipe. It is a tragic situation, and I'm not trying to minimize what that accident was. But that was different, and it's part of the reason why we've been pushing so hard for surveys, right? The survey helps inform us where we can and where we can't build a pipeline. And so one of the questions that came up, and I'll start checking some of these questions off, was what are some of the lawsuits that happened? And for purposes of the community, I was given a great opportunity and a chance to visit with Chairman Magrum, and I've provided some of the materials that are there that I'll try to reference throughout. However, I lost my train of thought on that one. I think what I'll do at this moment, I want to call on Rod Dillon. And Rod, would you be willing to talk about some of the safety concerns that you heard?
So already this year or last year, I met with the emergency managers of the counties to address how we're going to go forward, how we're going to educate the first responders to prepare and plan to respond to protect the public. It's not just fire, it's going to be law enforcement, it's going to be ambulance services, hospitals that will be educated on what CO2 will do, what CO2 does, what the effects are to humans, and we will have dispersion modeling developed for that training, and any equipment that they're going to need, they are addressing at this point. They're collecting data from all of their emergency responders to determine what they actually need to respond to C2 incidents. Atmospheric conditions determine the plume of a CO2 breach of our pipeline. The difference in a guillotine cut, worst case discharge, or a hole in the pipeline dictates how much CO2 is coming out. So we're going to address all that is the bottom line. I don't want to take up a lot of time with that, but we can talk about it anytime outside of this. We've already, like I said, met with emergency managers. They're collecting the information needed from first responders, and we're going to schedule training once we start construction of the pipeline. Okay?
Chairman Magrum, you may have some of the questions that you had written down. I've a couple of them that I've been able to refresh my memory. One of them was, are the property taxes payable to the county, right? And so as we talked about the property taxes that are up there, I think it was rightfully addressed that there is a pilot program, a payment in lieu of taxes. So we are assessed taxes. This is statutory, the tax abatement that exists. That tax abatement was set in place by the state of North Dakota, right? So the process for going through that is essentially, while we have that 10-year abatement, your county auditor will still go ahead and assess that tax. It's paid through the state of North Dakota. That is a fact. Now, that's something that was set up by the state to encourage infrastructure development, much like the development that we see here today. The question became, second to that was, what if this pipeline is sold? I think it's important to note that the PSC is the regulatory body that will go ahead and give us siting permission on our particular pipeline and give us permission for our pipeline. That's the same body if you were to try and transfer your pipeline that would have to approve what that looks like. So there is oversight in that particular condition. A question came up on whether or not Summit Carbon Solutions is specifically avoiding state lands with its pipeline, and it's simply untrue. These are private negotiations with a lot of different landowners. We have situations in which in our negotiations, we've been able to work with landowners who are adjacent to it, and we're happy to work with them and pay them for that right away and go around the state. But there are tracts. I verified with our team that we have a number of tracts, both Burleigh County, some in Emmons, that we are actually crossing on state lands. That's something that you guys can do your independent research and look up. But to be clear, we do seek out the opportunities, and sometimes when in those private negotiations, some of the landowners are happy to have the pipe on their land or happy to negotiate for what that looks like. And so a lot of our route, to this point was routed, and some of those opportunities that we can increase the amount of pipe that we have on people is kind of the case. So it's a bit of a false narrative here to suggest that we were intentionally avoiding the state, or to suggest further that the state of North Dakota is against this particular pipeline. Just this past week, Jay Volk and I actually had a conversation with two of the members from the state land department talking about some of the different leases that we have and updating them on the project. And we haven't received any pushback from the state of North Dakota regarding this project at this time. So do want to give it a chance for Grant Terry to talk about some of the construction. I know there were some comments about pipeline leaks on lateral and some other different concerns. Grant, would you like to address the members of the commission one more time?
So you have about 2 minutes, just so you know.
Comments on the lateral break? Did you hear that one?
Oh, the fracture propagation? Fracture propagation, when you're designing and engineering a CO2 line, you do have to take into consideration. You can mitigate it a couple different ways. So one way you can look at it, where they're called clock springs. It's essentially a resin wrap that you can essentially install at certain intervals along the line that would help prevent fracture propagation, which would be that, if you did have a rupture, it would go along like a longitudinal seam along a joint of pipe. We've chose to go the latter route and employ a heavier wall with the pipe, and that eliminates the possibility of the fracture propagation or mitigates it. So, that is something that we're concerned about, or not necessarily concerned, but was part of our initial planning. So there shouldn't be any issues when it comes to fracture propagation.
Chairman, I'll only add that we're willing to stick around and answer individual questions as well for some of the members if they have concerns. So we will stick around and be available for comments or questions.
Yeah, more than happy.
Okay, so if anybody didn't hear that, someone said they are willing to stay after the meeting and answer any questions anybody has, so. All right. After hearing all those things, I'll give one more chance for anybody else to speak. Does anybody else wish to speak?
I think one of the other questions that someone else had raised, and it's a question I have, is how many other pipelines have you built like this?
Okay. Absolutely, go ahead.
So I appreciate the question. I think it's an important answer, right? So the question is whether or not Summit Carbon Solutions as a company has built CO2 pipelines before. The answer is no, right? Having said that, the members of this team, me personally, I've been involved in the oversight of, the acquisition of over 300 miles of right-of-way, the overseeing some of the construction of pipelines in the Bakken. I know that every single member of this team, including Grant, and you may want to join me here at the podium and talk about some of your background experience, but we have a team of about 108 employees at this point, and I think that number is growing, with a high percentage of those being engineers, many of whom have actually worked on a number of different pipelines. Grant, go ahead.
I mean, speaking for myself personally, I've directly managed approximately 600 miles of pipe. It's all large diameter, 12-inch all the way up to 30-inch. That's over a large number of projects. I've been directly involved with, I'd say, close to 2,200 miles of pipe, at least in my career. And I'm low on the totem pole when it comes to the experience. At least I would say, based on the people I'm working with, I'm very proud to be working with some of the individuals I am. They're some of the best in the industry as far as their experience goes, and yeah.
So would it be safe to say that you guys don't actually physically build the pipeline? You're most likely going to bid it out to some sort of a pipeline contractor?
That's correct. So we'll be the ones that directly manage it, and we'll work and provide oversight for the construction contractors that have been doing it longer than I've been alive.
Right, but I mean, that's the fair, you guys are the owners and
Correct.
operators, but you will not actually construct the pipeline.
Correct, yes, sir.
We do design.
Correct. Well, we design it, we don't build it.
Right, okay. Because I mean, we use, like with the Dakota Access Pipeline, I mean, Michaels built it, and they were a very well-known contractor, but then they didn't manage it either. They built it and they moved on, and then Dakota Access managed it. So that's a similar scenario?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Commissioners.
So will you have somebody on site when they're doing this building or when they're constructing it?
Yes, so it's not going to vary. Well, I think the only state that varies is Iowa. But I mean, there'll be overall project oversight with every aspect of the construction process. And that's, I mean, just speaking to project inspection, it'll be essentially $130 million spent on just project inspection. That's just manpower, having the right individuals out, watching the right components of construction, whether it's CPWI, so that's certified pipeline welding inspector, a CWI, certified welding inspector. You have a NACE inspector that would be essentially inspecting all of the coating of the welds and the coating of the pipe itself. I mean, there's a large number of inspection that have to go onto this project. And then you have a state such as Iowa, who not only requires us to have our own individual inspection, but then each county is providing their own inspection in addition. So there will be inspection. This will, at least in my experience, this will probably be the most inspection on a project that at least I've ever worked on, based on what we're looking at now.
Chairman and Commissioners, I'll close with acknowledging that we have our construction manager, Jimbo Vaughn, who's in the back, who will also be around afterwards for questions. And we didn't get the chance to get into the pipeline reclamation. The majority of this has been on the safety concerns and the construction, but we have Jay Volk here, who's a specialist in that field as well. So thank you so much for your time. Any other questions for me?
I don't believe so.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, well, I feel like we're pretty much out of speakers, so at this point, I believe I'll close the public hearing. And so I guess the remaining part of the format will be left for commissioners if they have anything to say.
I guess the biggest thing is that we're more, for the safety of the people of Emmons County. I guess that's what we're here for, and finding the right answers and moving forward, I guess.
Definitely speak up if you have a question, people.
Nothing else to add?
Go ahead, Dave.
Can I ask a question here?
Well, if the commissioners are going to yield their time, then sure, yeah. Go ahead.
I have a question for the pipeline guy. Wouldn't the highest pressures be in North Dakota, being we're at the end of the line with all the others feeding in? So we'd be probably operating at the 2100?
Okay, so hold on. Just for the sake of those at home and those who can't hear that great, the question was, would the pressures be highest in Emmons County, obviously, since we are towards the end of the line and have the largest diameter? If you're going to answer that, I'd like you to do it at the microphone, please. Thank you.
I would say not necessarily. It's really, there's going to be a lot of variables that do go into it. It's going to depend on the individual location of the line, the proximity to a pump station, things such as that. Was that loud enough?
Satisfactory to me, I guess. Okay. Go ahead. Are there any other additional questions? We'll try and do everything at the microphone so everybody can hear.
Mr. Chairman, since we have the benefit of the safety personnel here, I was curious, when you have an incident, or should you have an incident, can you explain like how the response to that would be? You know, again, going back to the Emmons County Record article, the reporter had written about the Dakota gasification pipeline, which you guys have used, that there's been a CO2 pipeline from Dakota gasification. And in that article, it said that Dakota Gasification Company has its own team that responds to situations, and then the local emergency personnel help mitigate, like for crowd control or things like that, and that the company takes care of the situation. So my question is, will Summit be taking care of any situation?
Yes, Summit is responsible for any incidents that happen along our pipeline system. During our training, we're going to educate first responders, like I said, to the level of protecting the public. There's going to be a plume of product come out of the pipeline. And depending on the atmospheric conditions, they will, our team, Summit's team, and the first responders will determine in the training session how to evacuate if need be, how to block the roads off for each mile of the pipeline system. And of course, this is going to be stopped with the valve system, right? The pipeline will be shut down, and the residual within the pipe will lose its pressure, and the CO2 will just leach out until it equalizes with the atmosphere after the PSI is gone. And that's happened very quickly on our dispersion modeling. So I guess I answered your question. The first responders and the Summit employees are operationally will respond to an incident and to protect the public. There's not much, there's no cleanup to do. It's just, it's going to evaporate. It's going to disperse into the atmosphere. But we're going to protect the public from getting into it with the Sheriff's Department blocking the roads and that kind of stuff.
Are there any more questions?
So we're a landowner 5 miles from the pipeline, so we do have interest in this in a little bit, but I was part of that first responder team up at Basin Electric. I was an electrician up there for 6 years, so I've seen the safety side of it. These guys, they do have to have a lot of safety precautions, but I've also been out on the pipeline. I've serviced them. It was a 12-inch. It went down to a 10-inch, I believe. It was right around the same PSI. And the way that it worked with Basin is if there was a leak detected, they would send out an all call to all the farms and anybody that was located within a certain proximity of the pipeline. But I have been on the pipeline and I have seen leaks firsthand. We had to carry monitors to monitor the H2S in that, you know, when we went into the valve sites. So there is leaks. To me, it's not the concern of the pipe in the ground, it's the concern of the valves. So, because I have seen firsthand, and we have had to leave the site because of leaks. Now, on the insurance side of things, are they the primary carrier? you know, in the event that something happens, you know, are they going to cover that person's cattle? It depends how the contracts are written. I know I took a seminar back in May, and they talked about, it was a 2-hour seminar, and the subject of it was contracts that farmers are signing, and they really don't know what they're signing. And it was targeted towards the wind towers. And kind of after leaving that seminar, it was a gentleman that did insurance for 40 years. And after leaving that, I was like, there's no way in hell I'd sign a contract. So be careful what you're actually signing, and probably have an actual expert look it over before you even consider to sign it. So, and as far as, you know, when I worked on the pipeline and seeing and hearing about the dangers of CO2 and the H2S, I was like, there's no way in hell I'd want this down in Emmons County when I worked up in Beulah. So.
Okay. So I guess the question, which I'm kind of curious about too then, is are you guys, are you going to be responsible for property damage and things like that? Or is that going to lean more on the landowner with regards to like what's kind of the limitations, or what's kind of your normal negotiating scenario in that?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Commissioners. Under the terms of our easement, we have agreed to indemnification. We are, so to understand the differences, right, indemnification is essentially an admission of liability if there was ever an accident. So we've taken full responsibility. The only exceptions to that indemnification is for the gross or intentional actions of a landowner. If you take a gun and start shooting at one of our pipeline risers, you're putting yourselves in danger, and we appreciate it if you don't shoot at those things, right? And that is a situation in which perhaps our indemnification might not apply. Outside of that, we have indemnified the landowners through the terms of the easement so that we are responsible for any claims for any damage to persons or property, and that includes whether it's on their property or if it were to travel off of that. We have accepted indemnification and liability for the use of that easement.
But how would that process settle out? Would that be a negotiation, between Summit and a landowner? Is that settled through an arbitrator? Is that some kind, what's the typical, obviously every agreement may be different, but what's the typical scenario if something like happened?
Sure. So we've now gotten into a situation in which, so if a landowner was sued because their cattle had died as a result of our use of the easement, and there was some sort of leak, in that particular situation, we have agreed to indemnification, which means we are 100% responsible for that. And even if that landowner is suing the person that owns the land, we are responsible for that bill. That's how that works.
Right,
We have
but are you
indemnified them.
responsible for 100% of the value you place on it, or the landowner? How, that's
a court action, right? So it is
Okay,
a court,
so
it's a
gonna be
court action. Indemnification, I'm sorry to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, it's no different than an insurance claim or anything like that. What I think my house is worth, what worth the insurance claim, because the question is, okay, you're going to solve all that, and that sounds great, but exactly where's the clarification as far as responsibilities go? Do you guys have a cap? Are you limited to $1 million? That's where I'm asking. The general liability, if you will, what's your scenario with
Sure. So what we're mixing here is insurance versus indemnification. Indemnification has no limitation.
Okay.
There is zero limitation on indemnification. As a legal principle, we have agreed to accept responsibility for the use of the easement under those conditions and terms. If that were to cause damages, then we are responsible for what those damages are. That would be supported by the financial strength of the company and any insurance that they may have. And we work on those in different types of negotiations, but it's essentially supported by the full strength of the company itself.
And does your indemnification also place restrictions in that easement that coincide with your indemnification? Do you control the amount of stuff? Oops.
So sorry.
I know you didn't mean it.
Startling.
I could see you were scared as
Yeah.
I was. Okay. My point being, do you restrict the use on that easement then? Because since you are indemnified,
Negative.
So you have no control over. Obviously there's probably some limitations which are probably common sense, but you're not placing restrictions on production, things like that, because you have a liability in that easement.
That is correct. So you, the limitations that would exist over the easement, center line, 25 foot on either side of the easement is an area in which we wouldn't allow the building of structures. That is something separate. I think if I'm answering your question correctly, the limitations would be on our liability under indemnification is for the gross or willful misconduct of a landowner or an invitee. If you invite somebody on there and they are, acting in a way that is non-normal and outside of the scope of what would be indemnified, that's a different situation. With respect to the limitations, you can still plant on it, you can still grow over the top of it. We would restrict you from 25 foot from center line of that pipeline. The rationale for that is based upon the ability to bring an excavator in next to a pipeline. As we run our smart pigs, our smart tools through those lines, if we were to identify an anomaly, whether it was indentation, loss of pipe wall thickness, or other scenario, we may have to do what's called an integrity dig. We can get into this in more detail, and I'll gladly answer these outside of the meeting, but an integrity dig would require that we go enter back onto the right-of-way, open up that right-of-way, and do our inspection of the actual pipe itself. Right. So that's why we have a restriction on how close you can build to that, and that restriction is down to that 25 foot of center. Did I answer your question?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions?
Chairman Baker, does that indemnification transfer on, because as soon as it gets built, if it gets built, they're gonna sell it. So then who's holding the bag? Is my question.
Okay, so to clarify, just because the question wasn't asked to the microphone, would be, does the indemnification carry on if you were to sell the pipeline to some other operator?
Yes, Chairman Megrum, the answer is yes. The indemnification is in the contract that applies to the land. And our easement agreement is between Summit Carbon Solutions and the current owner and their heirs, assigns, or devisees. Essentially, it is something that has existed. It's attached to the land, and if it sells, that indemnification applies to both sides. The new owner, if you were to pass that down to your children, and if we were to assign our interest in this pipeline, every new owner takes that easement subject to that indemnification.
If someone requests that easement from you people this evening, will you give them a blank copy or your general easement to them, even if they are not in the footprint?
So that's an interesting question, right? So we prefer to work directly with the landowners that we're involved in. This is a private transaction between us and those landowners. And so to the extent that there's a specific interest, Mr. Commissioner, I'd be more than happy to sit down with you and do it in-camera review where we go through what it looks like. I don't know that we've published that openly, but I've been involved in hundreds, if not thousands, of easement documents, and it's pretty typical, much like your oil and gas leasing. I mean, there are some considerations, and I know that you've got some experience in that as well. There's nothing necessarily non-typical about our particular easement. It is an easement specific to CO2. It cannot be used for any other sort of commodity. One of the questions we've received in the past is whether or not what happens if Summit decides to change course. The answer is that pipeline right-of-way is for a CO2 pipeline. It cannot be used for another commodity. That is not what the easement allows. If we were to recondition and change this pipe to a different use, we do not have an easement, and we'd have to renegotiate with landowners. It is commodity specific. But no, we haven't shared it out publicly, but I don't think that that's for any nefarious reason. It's really just because we're engaged with specific landowners, and so I'm happy to talk about that with anybody one-on-one if they'd like to see what it looks like.
And as you told me earlier, there's no confidentiality agreement within that easement, like there were with the wind turbines, correct?
No. Thank you. Yeah, you were talking to Grant Terry on that question. I don't know if maybe you did ask.
I'm just addressing to the public, to you.
Yep. Yeah. No, I don't believe that there is.
Okay.
So, yes, single line, not multiple lines. It is a single line easement.
Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions?
Can the landowners negotiate with you people on royalty passing through that pipeline, on the footage that's on their property, on the volume going through per day? Has that been approached by you people, or has anybody confronted you on that issue?
Yeah, we've been asked that question a number of times, and it comes down to we have not negotiated any royalty payments across the pipeline. Our preference is to do a one-time payment across that particular pipeline.
Chuck, do you have a question? Well, if you're going to do it, step up to the microphone.
Thank you. Without going into the engineering facts of the pipeline, I do have a question about, so much has been talked about the maximum pressure of the pipeline. And then it was, if my inference is correct, the being on the tail end of this pipeline would probably not have the maximum pressure as it gets closer to the injection sites. Is that, am I understanding that correctly? Would that be?
The pressure on the system will be full. I mean, the goal when you're trying to operate one of these pipelines is to have it operate as efficiently as possible. So, you know, the main concern and the reason that you have a pressure on this line is to keep the CO2 in the state that we'd like to keep it in to transport it. So the pressures in different areas along the line are going to be kept at that pressure to maintain that state, as opposed to just operating at a uniform pressure across the entirety of the line. And that's going to be dictated by, again, where pump stations are located, how many inlets are coming into the line in a certain area. So those are some factors that's going to go into that.
The reason I brought that up was because when, during the Dakota Access presentations, we were told that the pressure would be at a certain point and that the volume was going to be in the neighborhood of 500,000 barrels a day. Does that ring a bell, Mr. Chairman?
I'd have to go back and look at my mountain of...
With the original?
No, originally, no, but this last hearing they had.
All right, hold on. We're not going to, hold on. We're not going to have everybody talking all at once. We're going to try and keep this orderly.
The reason I'm asking is because when the original proposal came through, it wasn't how many years did it take before they had to start putting additional pumping stations in, so that they kept the pressure and the volume consistent, since you're also going to be able to get more money if you can get 1 million barrels down the pipeline rather than hundreds of thousands. So that would be one question. And my concern at that point, and my family's, was Dakota Access was only 3 miles from our place, plus it crossed a creek with some really strange jogs. And the question was, and we were told not to worry about it, is that the pumping station was just above where these jogs were going underneath the creek. Now that gets closer to home because that creek flow is just right below our place. So my point is, or my question is it possible that you will have to start having additional pumping stations, however that would work with a CO2 pipeline, along the length of your pipeline? And just something to think about, 4 foot deep, how does that affect the hydrology in a given area? I mean, it's not very deep, but also you have surface flows that can be adversely affected once you start digging up and putting a pipeline in. Thank you.
So I guess to summarize what I think the questions are, I think the one question would be is probably, you are probably your goal is to maintain a specific pressure and you'll have enough pumping stations in a specific interval to adequately meet that pressure? Is that kind of a fair question?
That's correct.
Okay, so that's correct. So I think that was probably the main root of that question. So I guess the question I have then is, how often are you going to have a pumping station? Like, as far as, like, do you have a specific interval in mind already for the length of the pipeline, or? Because I just, for an example, I know with like Dakota Access, I think originally it was somewhere in the neighborhood of 500 to 600 miles, and then when they enhanced it, I think it went down to 300 miles, and so.
It's going to vary just based on how we have our laterals on our trunk lines coming into the main line, and the quantity of plants that would, the number of plants in Iowa versus South Dakota it's pretty different. So, I mean, just setting a flat distance for a pump station is not how that's approached. As far as on the project, I believe the last number was, we were looking at 16 for a max case, and that's across all 2,000 miles.
Okay. And is there going to be any pumping stations planned in Emmons County that you know of?
I'd have to look offhand. Personally, I'd have to look.
That's fair.
And in the Hazelton area, if this ever would get built, because Hazelton's within a mile and a half from this line, would you put in additional valves for safety reasons within a 5-mile area? So there isn't as much gas if you would end up with a problem with a leak?
It would just depend on.
Do you do it or do you not?
As far as putting in additional valves for a new connection, I mean, they base it off of that engineering study. So it would have to be a discussion with the county to be put in essentially at a whim.
Because I'm sure people are concerned as landowners living in that immediate area with a home dwelling where there's a 20-mile span on these valves and pressurized, the volume within that 20 miles versus a 5-mile segment. And that's why I'm just asking for the people in here.
Yes, sir.
If that's a consideration to do.
Again, there are other factors that go into it whenever you're looking at if it would be a new line. Are you talking about if a new line is coming in there, or are you just talking about looking at the existing
line
one?
that you would install, being you're by Hazelton, by a yard within a half-mile or a mile, would you break it with valves so you got a 5-mile segment versus a 20-mile span? For safety reasons around these homesteads.
The valve methodology, again, will follow that initial 20-mile minimum, and then based on the risk analysis study, the EFRD study, that's what's going to dictate where those valves go in between, and that's what they're going to do. Yes, sir.
Or if we illustrate it in an ordinance. Well, yes, that's just it's a fair comment to be made. So I think that's it for questions at the moment. Thank you. We have another question? Yep. Well, can you step up to the microphone? We're going to try and keep it orderly. Apologies for the walk.
This one's actually from my dad. He wants to know how much are they going to indemnify the family of the first person that's killed due to a leak? That's his question. So, and it's to that.
Yep, no, absolutely.
Yeah. So once again, indemnification is not limited. So it is. So the question is mixing essentially two components. What is the value on a loss of life? And I'm not even qualified to suggest what that would be, nor do I suggest that this is a case in this situation, right? Again, 20 years, 5,000 miles of pipe, 0 deaths. But the question was, how much would we indemnify? The answer is indemnification is for any loss or any damage. I'm not here qualified to tell you what the damage is for a loss of life, but I'm telling you that we've indemnified whatever that loss is.
So I guess to kind of piggyback on the question I had asked you earlier, probably a proper definition of it is in the event of an indemnification claim, you're probably going to submit it to your liability insurance, and then from it'd be similar to probably a liability insurance claim then? I mean.
Yeah, that is correct.
As far as valuations and all that, like it's not, I mean, the question I have is Summit going to be dictating those valuations, or is the process going to be like, okay, someone is basically submitting a claim against, let's say, your insurance, and then from there it follows the insurance guidelines and minutia of a typical insurance claim.
That is correct,
It's probably
right?
fair.
So we've accepted liability.
Right.
Under that indemnification, and whatever that obligation is, will we have insurance for some of those claims? Of course, that's prudent business.
Okay.
If it was to exceed the limits of our insurance, are we responsible for it? Yes, we are responsible for 100% of that loss.
Okay.
We have not limited our indemnification except for situations of essentially willful misconduct or gross negligence.
Okay. Are there any other questions? If you have any questions, now's the time. I mean, this is why we're having the hearing, so.
I just have a question on pipeline risers were mentioned. How often do you have a pipeline riser? And is that where a valve is?
It's a valid question. Thank you.
The only time you're going to have a riser above ground pipe would be typically, yes, at valves. So you're going to have, it'll vary, typically a 50 by 50 site for a valve. It'll be a fenced off site. You'll have the pipe come out of the ground. You'll have your mainline valve. You'll have your actuator that sits on top of the valve. It'll promptly go back down into the ground, and then you'll have your pressure transmitters on either side of the valve, and most likely a small platform to allow an operator to get up to service and provide any kind of regulatory reports on the valve itself. And that's essentially what's going to be in a above ground site.
I guess kind of a follow-up question to that. So at your pumping stations or like your valve sites, is there some kind of an expansion tank or something to allow for fluctuations, kind of like similar?
Oh, like surge protection?
Right. In the event that you have a scenario where you have an increase or decrease in pressure, almost, you have something that controls that, or if you needed to, let's say, shut a valve promptly at one
Correct.
site, you have some expansion, so that way you can capture some of that.
So when you're designing a pipeline, you have to conduct, and this is federal requirement, you have to conduct what's called a surge analysis. And a surge analysis is what dictates what mitigating, properties you have to install with a system in the event of unforeseen valve closure. So if we're pumping, max capacity, 2183 PSI in an area and a valve shuts, what happens to the line? That's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of product moving. That is a study that we have to conduct based on where our valves are located and a bunch of operating variables. And then that dictates what surge tanks or other mitigation steps need to be taken during the construction to prevent that. And that is something that we have done. Yes, sir.
Because the reason for my question is being that if you have a controlled site, it's fenced off, it's, similar. I mean, we have a pumping station here for the Dakota Access, so everybody's at least somewhat familiar with it, but there's a large tank. So there will be some kind of storage of the CO2, at least temporarily, on a site above ground?
No, not necessarily. I mean, the only thing that would be, if you're implying the surge protection in the event that something happened, yes, if it did dictate us to have a surge tank in the event that you did have an unforeseen valve closure and that was required, per that study, then yes, we would have that there. Would it see normal storage of CO2 on a day-to-day basis? No.
Right, but it could. I mean, if you had a tank, the purpose of it is probably to temporarily store. I mean, the reason, I'm not trying to trick you, but my main reason for the question is, now you have a pipeline setback versus you have a setback of a above ground structure of some kind that if it were to leak and store a specific amount of CO2, would that setback have to vary because of that? Because obviously you're going to have maybe a large tank that's going to store a certain amount, or at least designed to, and without any ground to stop it, something happening to that tank, you're going to get probably a faster transfer of this out there. So do you want to have that setback? I mean, that's the reason for my question is, should we be taking into account a setback for a structure above ground, and if there's some kind of tank with it or something. I mean, those are just kind of questions and concerns that I have too, and not just the pipeline, but the above ground structures with it, so.
I'd say outside of an operational anomaly that resulted in surge mitigation needing to be utilized, there would be no CO2 stored above ground.
Right, but I mean, just to be fair to everybody too, I mean, the whole point of setbacks is for an operational anomaly. So, I mean, that's kind of what we're planning for, I guess, or, preparing for, but hoping doesn't happen. So that's just for informational purposes, but thank you. Does anybody else have any questions?
Chairman Magrum, I have just I'm not involved in this area, fortunately, but I have a hypothetical question. 7 or 8 years down the road, the federal government comes out and said this carbon capture is BS, and they abandon this line. Who's responsible for cleaning up this mess?
Okay, so I guess we do have a reclamation question, Jeff. So whoever would like to tackle the.
So, Chairman Magrum and fellow commissioners, if I understand the correction correctly, right, in the event that we were no longer to flow CO2, you would render the pipeline sort of clean and render and abandon it from use and take it out of commission, right? We would not dig that pipeline up and tear up the ground again. That creates another sort of problem that you had when you first did your construction. Pretty common practice to essentially render that pipeline clean, and I think I'll call on Rod on this. Rod, you've done pipeline decommissioning in the past and rendered something clean. Perhaps you could talk about what that looks like.
Well, I have not, but typically, when I worked at Kinder Morgan, we did do decommissioning, and some landowners, if they requested, will dig it up. But nitrogen purging, cleaning out the line, nitrogen purging, shut it down, that's basically what we did.
So by decommissioning it, you basically empty it of all its contents.
Yes, and nitrogen blanket the whole thing.
Right, and that's probably a specific process, probably guideline by PHMSA.
PHMSA guideline, that, yes, sir.
Okay.
So it's up to the landowner to clean it up.
Evidently, just like the old railroad system.
Well, it's kind of what it seems like is that they decommission the pipeline, and yes, if you'd want it removed from your property, you either have to negotiate that with the company, or if that's not a part of the negotiation, then yeah, probably leave it or remove it yourself according to, but that's.
There's no clause within that easement on that what Jack just asked about.
Yeah. Commissioner, individual contracts, if that was something that was negotiated and it was a removal, we certainly can. It's been my experience that the amount of damage and disruption that you do from putting the pipeline in and the amount of time that it takes to grow it back, it's different for every person. If you wanted it decommissioned in that particular way, we could certainly negotiate with any landowner on what that would look like.
It's good enough for me.
Remind the commission that we will stick around for questions afterwards. If there's others that are similar, we'd be happy to stick around and answer individual questions.
I've got another question for you in regards to easements, being these people brought it up with the state versus the individual.
Yes, sir.
That easement with the state, is that the same easement that the individual is negotiating on?
The state already provides their own easement form. They always have. This is true across all oil and gas industry in the state of North Dakota. It is, the state only uses their own form.
I just want the people to be aware of that.
Yes, of course. Yes. Okay.
Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions? Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, I think with the questions done, I guess the commissioners have any additional questions now that we had some more. Does our legal counsel have any questions?
I don't know, at this time, thank you.
Okay. Well, I guess I just have a few thoughts on it, and I suppose we can wrap this up. One of the few joys of being chairman is you get to speak last. There's a lot of discussion tonight. I didn't really prepare anything or bring anything. I wanted the public hearing to kind of dictate maybe my own opinion on it. I didn't want to turn it into a summit hearing because this ordinance would affect every pipeline from now on. I mean, it's not just carbon. Obviously, carbon is the main reason we're discussing it because it's the current project that's happening. So naturally, when things come up, you talk about them. So I'm glad Summit came and answered the questions that they answered. Whether that answered your questions or not, they will be available. I'm sure there's more than enough phone numbers and email addresses and everything. If you have more information, you want to seek more information, they'll probably help you out the best they can. Throughout this whole hearing, the one thing that's kind of plagued me more than anything is the only benefit I hear about this project is money. I don't really foresee or see a lot of benefits that happens right here in Emmons County. I haven't heard from anybody that it's going to mean cheaper fuel prices, electrical rates, or any of the other things that maybe would benefit us enough to go, this risk is worth it. That's the part that bugs me the most. As far as the tax dollars, there is a 10-year tax exemption. The county does receive those $400 and some thousand. It won't come from Summit. It will come from the state treasury because the state passed that exemption. And so the money coming into the county is going to come from your state treasury. So I guess to be fair, it's like taking money out of your savings account, putting it into your checking account and acting like you got paid. So if that's how you feel about things, then it's good. I don't see the value in that either. I don't. And the other problem I have with these projects and what got brought up is it seems like Emmons County has an opposition to these projects, but the fact of the matter is the majority of the projects that have come through here have been what we call green energy projects, renewable projects. I don't think there's a big appetite for them in Emmons County. It doesn't seem like there is. And I think a lot of the opposition doesn't come from the fact that it's a pipeline or a wind tower or a solar panel. It comes from the fact that it seems like most of these projects are subsidies built on subsidies built on subsidies. And a conservative area like Emmons County just doesn't really like the fact of subsidies or this green energy idea. So I think the opposition comes from that too. And that's where, you know, this money doesn't seem to mean anything. It seems to be printed off. It's just paper money through deficit spending, and we all see it on the inflation side, on the backside. The reason your tax dollars don't go down is because we're paying $5 fuel like the rest of you guys are. We're paying $500,000 for a blade that used to cost $280,000 5-10 years ago. It's all inflationary. It's all comparable. We're all paying the same prices too. So when this 400,000, 800,000, $1.2 million comes in, does it actually affect us? It does. It does in the fact that we're paying for that inflationary rate down the road anyway, and so nobody sees the benefit of it. The other thing that happens with these numbers is the $400,000 that gets brought up doesn't go to the county. It comes into the county treasury, but then it gets dispersed amongst your different subdivisions. The school's going to get half of that, and then the other divisions that are, you know, accessible to those tax dollars are going to get it. So that $400,000 doesn't go to the county for your property taxes. Roughly $180,000 might go to it, and then it gets divided up amongst your various boards. So you might only see $60,000 of it in your roads. That's why it's hard to see, because you hear these big numbers and you go, where's all this money? Well, everybody gets a little piece of it, and that little piece is harder to deal with than, if we got $500,000, you might see a significant drop, but everybody takes their piece. And the school side of it, most people know from the wind and the oil pipelines that 75 cents to every dollar usually gets held back from the state on those PILT payments, which the state decides what the value of that payment is, not the counties. So we basically just get the money that they say we get, and that's all negotiated by legislation and tax law and all the other stuff. So just to sum up some of that, the other issue that came up that was discussed was the state land and their participation. Well, I worked at a coal mine for 8 years, and the one thing that I know is we avoided state and federal land as much as we could because they're very difficult, if not impossible, to negotiate with. Like Jeff mentioned, they have a way they deal with you. They tell you what they want. You participate or you do business somewhere else. So naturally, you're going to avoid the places you don't think you can negotiate with or you don't think you have maybe some power over. So that probably answers the state issue on that one too, is that they can go on the state land. It's just, it's probably going to be more expensive or more difficult because they don't negotiate with you like maybe a county or land individual would. As far as waiting for the legislature to make a decision, that's a difficult scenario in itself because the legislature's in session right now. They're not going to make a decision till maybe this month, maybe March, maybe April, till some of those bills finally hit the floor. And then when they are passed, if passed, they're not enacted till, I think the earliest they can go into place is maybe June or July, but most of them are usually at the end of the year. So we have a Public Service Commission for May 9th on this project right now for their siting permit for the state. We won't have legislation for that. There will not be anything in place other than the current law. So if we're not satisfied with the current law, then this is the place to discuss it. So the legislature really isn't a lot of help in that regard at the current moment. I got so many notes here, I can't remember which ones I want to talk about. As far as the eminent domain goes, the one thing that really kind of bothers me more than anything in the discussion of eminent domain is that I find it very hard to believe that that's the easiest path to go to when you're trying to seek value on property, because the eminent domain process is tedious. It involves lawyers, courts. I don't even think Summit wants to go through that, to tell you the truth. It's not an easy process, but they're going to do what they need to do, and the individuals that are in here that need to take recourse on it are going to do what they have to do. And I don't think anybody in here goes, well, let's just have eminent domain settle what we're going to do. I don't think anybody wants to do that. So the eminent domain discussion is simply people that don't want to participate and Summit not wanting to move their pipeline, and so that's where it's probably going to land. So as far as eminent domain goes, this county has, and to my knowledge, continues to oppose it 100%, at least for this project, because like I discussed, I don't think anybody wants this project in this county, and if they do, I mean, that's what we had this hearing for tonight, and it seems to be overwhelming support to at least create large setbacks, and for some people, probably not even have this pipeline in this county. So that's why we had this hearing, and that's where that lands. But I guess to wrap it up, the one thing that my neighbor John Beck brought up that I was thinking was that it seems that money drives all these decisions. Money is the only reason we're supposed to support this project when, like he said, man, people crossed oceans and crossed the country and settled in this frigid prairie. and now all of a sudden we're afraid we're going to miss out on a few tax dollars, and we're supposed to sell our land rights and sell our safety rights for that. I don't believe that for 1 second. So the setbacks argument discussion is absolutely vital. We have a tough decision to make, because if we go too far, we're going to look exclusionary, and you got to remember, this ordinance is not just for the carbon pipeline, it is for all pipelines. And I don't think anybody in here opposes all pipelines. I think it's pretty fair that a lot of people view this project as a green renewable project, and we don't think we need it. So I think that we have to be careful not to try and exclude for one project and hurt other projects, but at the same time, residents of this county have to be paramount. We're losing residents. I mean, Emmons County has shrunk so much in the last 50 years, even the last 10 years. I mean, money doesn't mean anything if you don't have any people. So we have to weigh all these decisions, and money can't be the only reason that we move aside for some of this stuff. So those are just some of the opinions I have over the course of this thing. I've already probably spoke too much, but I guess in summary, the next county commission meeting, I believe, is February 7th. And we are going to discuss it probably first thing in the morning. So I would probably assume at this time, it'll probably be at about 9:15. We'll probably reserve about an hour. I don't believe we'll take any testimony at that time. That's what tonight was for, and I think we had enough. I think we had good participation. We didn't hold anybody back from speaking. So that time will be allotted for the commissioners to allow discussion, amendments, any information they want to bring forward, and I think we'll come to some sort of a resolution at that meeting, and that resolution will get sent on to the PSC at the earliest convenience so that they can utilize that for their siting. And I guess that's how this process is basically going to work. So I thank everybody for coming. I thank everybody for participating, and Any questions or concerns, the commissioner's information is on the website for phone numbers and emails. You can contact the auditor if you need contact information for anybody. And I believe Summit's willing to stay back after the meeting to discuss things. You're welcome to discuss them too. And I'd ask that you don't linger around too much longer because folks got to close the place up and do that. So I'd say if it's going to be a really long discussion, maybe try and find some other place so nobody's here till midnight. So thank you all for coming. This public hearing is adjourned.
You've been watching a special report on Beck News. Now back to our regularly scheduled programming.